Best to get enough chairs in. Thank you for coming. My name is Linda Johnson, and I'm the Executive Secretary of ISS, and it's my privilege to welcome you all here today. The idea of organising this panel on university education with a global orientation was triggered by a coincidence of two events. First is the visit this month to the Netherlands by Professor Martha Nussbaum. Martha is an honorary doctor of ISS, an award that was bestowed on her in 2006. She has received honorary doctorates from almost 40 universities, so it's not a unique privilege to have this association with Martha, but we are indeed very proud that we do have this association with you. And we're always very, very pleased when you're able to visit ISS and share your ideas with us. This is the programme for today. You'll find it also in the little booklet on your seats. The second event that made us decide to hold today's activity was a sad event. It was the death in February this year of our first woman Deputy Rector for Education, Dr. Jos Mooi. Jos was a product of the universities of Wageningen and Amsterdam. She joined ISS in the mid-1990s and remained with us until her death, except for a break of a few years when she lived and worked in India. She was strongly committed to internationally oriented education. She was for several years chair of the Teaching and Learning Committee of ISS. She worked intensively on educational cooperation with Suriname. She also led the cooperation in teaching with our sister faculty of social sciences within Erasmus University Rotterdam and with the University College Leiden here in The Hague. Jos had a special vibrancy and an exceptional ability to connect with all types of colleague, student and partner. After recovering from cancer, she became our Deputy Rector for Education. She led a major reform of our master's teaching programme and brought it to a smooth completion despite the recurrence of her cancer in 2011. Sadly, her health collapsed early this year and she passed away very quickly. We wanted an occasion to publicly honour her as a special colleague and as a champion of university education with a global perspective, education with an open mind and an open heart, all of which qualities she exemplified. This occasion seemed to us to be just such an opportunity. Jos is sadly no longer here, but like all ideas of stature and substance, her ideas and her energy continue to inspire us. Moving on to today. Universities help to form the next generation of change agents, and they can provide a special and necessary type of forum within society, intellectual and social spaces that combine the necessary wide-ranging exchange and unconstrained reflection together with, to borrow from Robert Merton, cosmopolitan openness, organised skepticism and intellectual rigour. But to fulfil this potential, special contribution requires that we do not reduce the university from, in the phrase from John Henry Newman and others in the 19th century, the seat of universal learning, to being simply a machinery for supporting economic expansion and a short-sighted view of national self-interest. Martha Nussbaum has been a significant voice in articulating the case for global perspectives in university education and in all university work, especially in her books Cultivating Humanity and Not for Profit. Similar ideas are found in the philosophy of, for example, the new university colleges in the Netherlands, the Humanistic University, and ISS, of course, and more broadly, in some of the other work on internationalization in general terms in other universities in the Netherlands. How does one work in practice with this sort of educational ideal? Martha gave an interview on this topic in Amsterdam last year, and I was privileged to be the interviewer. We've highlighted an extract from the interview in the announcement for this event, and it's on the screen behind me. The purpose of this event is to discuss how we can pursue such objectives in the real world of universities and contemporary society, and in the face of other pressures, some of which pull in the opposite direction. And how can we relate such ideals to very diverse sorts of student audience and academic context? I would like now to welcome first our panelists, Martha Nussbaum, professor at the University of Chicago. From slightly closer to home, Dr. Sissy Fu from the University Campus Leiden, University College Leiden, and Dr. Karolina Surrency from the University of Humanistics in Utrecht. And finally, Professor Des Gasper, who actually is at home because he's from ISS. Des has been the intellectual organizer behind this event, and I'm very grateful to him for that. I would like now to invite Martha to come up and give us a talk of about 20 minutes. After that, each panelist will respond a little, add a little, and then we'll open the conversation as soon as possible to the rest of the room. It'll be a tricky job to have a conversation with so many people, but we'll do our best. Without further ado, I'd like to hand over to Martha.
Well, thank you. It's an enormous pleasure to be here. I've spent now the past week in the Netherlands talking particularly about religious intolerance, but that's not what I'll talk about today, although that is the topic of my new book. I will address this question of the use of the imagination for education in a global context very briefly. And so the structure of what I'm going to say is that first, I'll give you 3 examples of education that uses the imagination in ways that I think have been very productive. Then I'll step back and give you some sort of philosophical background defining empathy, compassion, and other concepts. But then look at some recent findings in cognitive psychology that help us think about what our capacities are, where they can go wrong, and how they can be trained in a broader direction. Then I'll go back to the 3 examples and tell you what was done well. So the first example is Rabindranath Tagore, the great Indian author, philosopher, composer, and importantly, educator. He set up a school in Shantiniketan in West Bengal that was centered around both Socratic self-examination and the arts, and was deliberately global, although, of course, initially within India, but then as the fame of the school grew, more and more from all over the world. And so its challenge was to integrate students from different religious and ethnic groups in India, but also students from abroad, and very centrally, to integrate males and females, because the school started in 1905, a time when women had very little freedom, and so that was a passion that lay really right at the heart of what Tagore did. Now, just to give you a vignette of what he did in the school, since he was a composer and also a choreographer, he made dance very central to the school, and he composed elaborate dance dramas. The economist Amartya Sen went to the school, but it's his mother I want to talk about now. Amita Sen was one of the people who participated particularly centrally in these dance dramas, and she's written a book about the school that tells what she thinks this contributed to global citizenship. It's called Joy in All Work. So the first thing she wants to say is that they learned about the world in an atmosphere of joyful participation, but in particular, by dancing, they learned with their bodies, and women learned not to feel ashamed of their bodies. They learned to integrate their bodies, often in quite dramatic and sometimes intimate ways, with the bodies of other people from different places, and so on. And so quite generally, she feels that they got an education that prepared the future of a global nation. And she said, things about the progress of the nation, or the future nation, were always on their minds. And it was really part of everything that they did. Now, the second example is one that was indirectly inspired, indeed, by Tagore's school, because he had many world imitators, and one person who was doing similar things, probably in conversation with Tagore, was John Dewey in America, who, once again, insisted on using the arts and theater and drama and so on as linchpins of children's education. And this is a more generic example because it happens, I'm happy to say, in a lot of places and in a lot of different ways. But to learn the history of race relations in America, a particularly vital part of any Americans becoming a global citizen, because I think globalism is about how you relate to other groups in your own society as well as groups abroad, and you can't do the two apart. Children don't just learn some facts about American history. They may well have different ethnic and racial groups in their class, but you can't count on that because America is largely de facto segregated by class and location and so on. So again, the arts come to people's aid, and on a given day, you would find young children, perhaps ages 8 or so, putting on a play about the civil rights movement. One white child would be cast to play the part of African-American woman Rosa Parks, who had to sit in the back of the bus. And then she's feeling with her own body what it is to be stigmatized and excluded, and in that way learns a lesson that's much richer than what she would get from just listening to speeches or reading some facts about history. So that's very similar to Tagore's case, but it's applied to address the urgent problems of a particular very unjust society. The third example is sort of related to that because it's one that I know well, and it starts in my own city, and that is an institution called the Chicago Children's Choir, which was started originally to replace music programs that had been cut out of the schools, but it also has an after-school aspect that's volunteer. So it has about 4,000 children in it, 80% below the poverty line, and it has therefore a large membership of African Americans and of Latino students. And it brings together students from different racial and ethnic groups, which the schools do not do because they're largely de facto segregated, as I've said. And what this choir does, I mean, you might think that a choir of that sort in Chicago would sing spirituals because that's what African Americans are supposed to sing. Deliberately, although they do that sometimes, they do not do primarily that. They want to give the message that these students are really global citizens, and they can go anywhere. So they teach them Korean music, South African music, and then at least some of them go travel, and they go to these countries and have performed with children's choirs in South Africa, in India, in Korea, and so on. And when I talked to Molly Stone, who's the associate conductor of the choir, about what she thought that this whole experience contributes to citizenship, she said some really interesting things. I mean, once again, she placed the accent on the body. She said that children of this age are very uncomfortable with their bodies and ashamed, and to blend your breath with someone else requires great trust and great confidence. And this physical activity of singing and making the sounds within your own body teaches you both to have respect for other people's bodies and to love your own body, which is also quite important. And then she said it also does teach people ultimately that they're not confined to a particular part of the world, but they can go anywhere. And so here's just one story that illustrates that. One day she came into the rehearsal room of the concert choir, and 3 African-American girls were going over a passage from a Bach motet that they'd been rehearsing. And she said, "Oh, so you're going to get in some extra rehearsal time?" And these girls said, "No, we're just chilling." You know, so that they would just feel that the way they would relax together with their friends was to sing Bach. He told you that they're no longer thinking, "Oh, we're ghetto people, ghetto culture is for us," etc. And then Molly herself remembered her own childhood as the only Jewish kid in the mostly African-American choir. When they learned a Hebrew folk song, she felt a sense of inclusion and respect that people were taking an interest in her culture. So that it works in both directions. So those are my 3 examples, and I'll come back to them later. But now for some definitions. Did I push the wrong button here? I think there's a keyboard here. But anyway, first of all, the first term I want to introduce is empathy. Now, empathy, typically, now people use the word in different ways, but as I'm going to define it, and as is most commonly defined, means participatory outlook. That is positional thinking, it's sometimes called. Seeing the world and feeling it from the point of view of another person. And in fact, psychologists have shown that very young children have that capacity. There are ways of testing pre-verbal children, and it turns out that really by 1 year old, they're pretty adept, as the psychologist who does this work, Paul Bloom of Yale, calls it, mind readers. That is, they can figure out what their parents might be thinking and, of course, use it often to get what they want from their parents. So empathy is that. Now, that's not necessarily moral. Because as you can see, you can just use it to inveigle the parents into giving you what you want. And you can also do worse things. A good torturer, a skilled torturer, will use empathy with the victim to know what's most painful and most humiliating to the victim. Or to use a slightly less terrible example, a good prosecutor will use empathy with the witness to attack and destroy the witness on the stand. So empathy is morally neutral. It doesn't necessarily go in a good direction. However, in people of basically good character, it can often go in a good direction. Now, the next term I want to introduce is compassion. Compassion is, as it were, empathy plus good character. That is to say, it's an attitude, an emotional experience that experiences pain at the suffering of other people. And it includes the sense that this suffering matters and that it's really, really bad. Now, compassion isn't perfect either, because we can all fail to see what's really importantly bad. We might see something that's bad and not feel compassion because we don't quite understand why it's bad. Or, very importantly, we might have great compassion for something that if we understood the world better, we would see it wasn't so bad. So, Americans are often whining and complaining about paying their income tax, and somebody might have compassion with oh, how terrible that you have to pay such and such % in tax. And that kind of compassion would be real enough, but not very well directed morally. But when the values involved, the sense of what's really important are good, compassion is actually a morally valuable emotion. I'll just mention one other one, and that is sympathy, just because you may wonder how that's related to both. Sympathy is like compassion broader. That is, sympathy, you can have sympathy with both the joy and the sorrow of another person, whereas compassion is usually linked to sorrow and would naturally be a painful emotion, whereas sympathy could be good. So those are the 3 that I want to talk about. Now, findings that we now know about from psychology. And of course, earlier philosophers had said these things. This isn't so new, but it's been now experimentally worked on quite a bit. Daniel Batson of the University of Kansas, who spent a life of very wonderful research. In fact, he's just retired from teaching and has a big book called Altruism in Humans that summarizes the results of his research. He spent his career looking at the connection between narrative imagination and compassion. So here's how a typical Batson experiment goes. Students come in, and of course most psych experiments in most places are done with undergraduate students, free help as it were, but the students come in and they're told they're going to listen to a radio broadcast. One group is told, don't pay any attention to the story, just listen to the technical characteristics of the broadcast. The other group is told, really put yourself into it. Think about the story and imagine the points of view of all the people in it. All right, so they're asked to exercise what I've called empathy. And group 1, that just listens to the technical characteristics, the story is usually something about the suffering of some fellow student, because it has to be near to home, and you'll see why. So a student, let's say, has broken her leg, and she needs to be driven to class for a week, or else she'll fail all her courses. So that's the general setup. The first group, they don't report any emotion, and they don't do anything to help this real student. Second group, first of all, they do, by and large, report compassion. So why does empathy lead to compassion? Well, because they're basically decent people, and they have no animus against this fellow student, and so naturally they do make that move. But then what's most interesting is that in a large proportion of the cases, they actually go and do the thing that would help that student. Now, it has to be something easy, it has to be close, no distractions, and so on. And yet they do drive that student to class. So compassion leads to helping behavior. Now, however, there are a number of problems along the way that Batson has found. The first thing is what we might call the normative unreliability of compassion inspired by a narrative that we imagine. That is to say, people get so hooked on the story that they forget about their general principles of fairness. So he's done some experiments in which people learn a general principle of what would be a fair way of allocating scarce kidneys. And they really agree that this is the best principle. Then they hear one very vivid story of a woman whose lover has just deserted her, and her mother is ill, and so she has all these woes. And typically they will jump her up to the top of the transplant list, even though it goes against the principle that they've already agreed to. So that shows you that compassion is unreliable unless it's accompanied always with decent principles and with what I might call constant Socratic self-examination that would ask you, why are you doing this? What is the fair way of doing it? And so on. Second problem is that people are not very happy with people they don't know. This is something that both Batson and Paul Bloom, whom I've already mentioned, have done a lot of research on. People just don't like people who aren't familiar. They can get familiar with almost anyone, but in the first instance, they're going to prefer the people that they know to the people that they don't know. And this is probably a very deep evolutionary instinct that people have. So that's a challenge that education needs to surmount if we're going to get decent behavior, helping behavior that's not too uneven. And finally, compassion doesn't live alone. It's surrounded by other emotions. And there are a lot of them that one could talk about here, envy, fear, but I'll just talk about one that I've been particularly interested in, and that is disgust. Disgust. In most societies, there are groups that are viewed, sorry, I have a piece of nut in my throat. Can I just get some water? I'll take this bottle, thanks. Isn't this easier? No, bottle's always better. So disgust is an emotion that we, in the first instance, feel toward bodily fluids, things that smell bad, things that we think will contaminate us. But in all societies, people project these traits, bad smell, potential contamination, stickiness, hyperanimality, onto certain subordinate groups who kind of emblematize the animal and whom they use to, as it were, distance their own transcendent selves from the merely animal. This was a big part of racism directed against African Americans in America, where the prohibitions on shared drinking fountains, shared swimming pools, and all of that expressed, of course, a fear of racial mixture, miscegenation, but it was just, in general, a more general bodily shrinking from people who were thought to be somehow contaminating and physically disgusting. So now, one of the things this shows is why the body is so important, because if you just learn at a distance something about African Americans, that doesn't get over this bodily shrinking that many people are inclined to feel. So how shall we, now going back to my three examples, how are these problems surmounted? How do we cultivate what African American novelist Ralph Ellison called the inner eyes of people? That is, the eyes, he said, that they use to look out through their physical eyes on reality. And in his novel Invisible Man, we see that those inner eyes are often very obtuse, very uncultivated in all the ways I've just mentioned. Well, if you think about what Tagore was trying to do, Tagore was preoccupied with the narrowness of women's lives, and he wanted to create a space in which, with their bodies, women might explore areas of freedom and choice that they had not had before. And when I used to listen to Amita Sen talk about that experience, it's so wonderfully exhilarating how, if you leap across the stage, that's just such a new thing for a woman who had been taught to be ashamed of her body. And it also, then very importantly, worked against the stigmatization of women as hyper-animal, hyper-bodily, because it got people to see these bodies as beautiful, as flexible, as wonderful. She was known as the Green Fairy because she danced that role, and that's a name of beauty, not of disgust. And it taught the different groups who were strangers to overcome the fear of strangers. Now, it still didn't give you good principles, so that has to still come in from philosophy, and so I think the imagination has to always work in conversation with good political principles, but it did quite a lot. If you think about the US classroom, Dewey was doing just exactly the same thing, thinking that to learn about race, you have to put your body in that position, and you have to feel what it is to have people regard your body as contaminating and disgusting. And when you feel that with your own body at age 8, then that really changes how you think about these things in the future. And finally, the choir. Once again, it's the same theme, that you don't just sit there in a classroom learning some facts about India, Korea, South Africa, but you, first of all, blend your breath with other children from different groups in your own society when you learn the music of South Africa. But then they were lucky that they could do this, that they actually could travel and perform together with children from other cultures of the world, and having an experience that included mutual respect, but respect that was stimulated by this very embodied experience of participating in the creation of imaginative works of art. So I think this all gives us some lessons for education in a global context. First of all, that it really must have the arts at its heart, and I believe there are many different other ways to use the arts in public culture. The book of mine that'll come out next year is a lot about public art and public monuments and so on. But in just confining ourselves to schools, the arts need to have a very prominent role in schools, because it's only when the body gets involved that we learn lessons in a new way. Second thing that we learn is that we need to focus on issues of stigma and exclusion. Need to think, what are the problems that our students have? Who are the strangers they fear? And then get them to be more at home, more familiar with the people that they're inclined to feel strange, whether it happens to be the African Americans who live 1 block away, or whether it's somebody on the other side of the world. And of course, that means that the education works in tandem with history as well as with the arts. And finally, I think the Batson experiments show us that all the cultivation of imagination in the world is free-floating and unreliable unless it's also accompanied by serious critical argument, self-examination in the spirit of Socrates. Tagore knew that too, because all the education in his school was Socratic in nature. Students were constantly examining themselves and thinking about principles for the new nation and so on. So that dialogue between the imagination and principles is crucial, because, so Batson puts it this way, that there's this terrible dilemma that compassion is a rich resource for helping, but it's terribly unreliable. You can see this in philanthropy, where you put up a picture of one child and then somebody will give to that one child, and that's not necessarily a good way of helping. But somehow it's a powerful engine of helping, and yet it just isn't very good on its own. So it has to be in a constant dialogue with good principles that embody ideas of fairness. Now, just one last thing I'll say is that we know now that the instinct of fairness is also a part of our evolutionary heritage. Paul Bloom's new book, which will come out in about a month, is called Just Babies. Now, it's a pun. It means only babies, but it also means just in the sense of fair babies, because he's shown that pre-linguistic children have instincts of fair behavior. They are averse to when they see somebody snatching something from somebody, and in general manifest discomfort at unfairness. So that's something we also have as a resource in our personalities. It's very incipient, and it needs to be developed. So that's the job of education, is to take these resources, take what we know about the obstacles they face, and then to develop it in the direction of a truly fair kind of global imagination. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Martha, for that inspiring start to our conversation. Might I invite the panelists to come and sit behind the table? You'll see where your names are, so please do just take the seat behind the name that seems the most appropriate to you. And without interrupting the flow too much, there's lots of information about our panelists in the leaflets on your chairs, and so I will just simply hand over straight away to Dr. Sissy Fu to talk a little bit, her intervention for this afternoon. Thank you very much, Sissy.
Thank you.
If you would like to sit here, stand here, that's fine. If you want to stay sitting, that's also fine.
I think I'll remain sitting, if that's all right.
Great.
Thank you for the invitation to speak as part of this panel on global education and also the role that imagination plays in this particular context. Before I start, I just want to say that it's especially and a special pleasure for me to be here since I had the honor of working with Jos Moore in some small capacity as Director of Studies for the BA at LUC The Hague. She has been a tremendous help and inspiration for the development of our major in international development at LUC. And for that, LUC and I especially am very grateful to her and to ISS. So many points of connection to help us think through how global citizenship could be imagined, could actually become realized. So thank you very much, Martha. Just starting with Martha's three examples that has to do with some connection with the embodiment that comes with being alive in one's physical form, and also the respect and the kind of dignity that comes with using our body in a way that perhaps starting from the perspective of the history of Western philosophy, in fact, we get that bifurcation very, very quickly between the mind and the body. This is something that has been explored by more contemporary philosophers, philosophers of the flesh, if you will, really even starting with epistemology, right, and the very existence of the form that absorbs knowledge, right? And here I think about this thick book, co-authored, one of the authors being George Lakoff, right? How the emotions, right, and the embodiment of the emotions actually help us get a better idea of who we are as human beings, and that being a part of how we think, of how we live. So not a complete rejection of rationalism, but rather that even with Hume, right, it's through our senses, it's through empirical understanding, right, and the absorption of the world around us that we become connected to the world, right? This has been taken up, of course, by a lot of political philosophers. The one dear to me is Hannah Arendt, and her idea of amor mundi, love of the world. And here we connect back to imagination, one of the key themes of the panel here today. Rather than looking at the affective aspects through cognitive psychology, I'd like to focus a bit and get us to think about really, through strangeness, the notion of distance. We might wish to believe that when we are at home, we feel comfortable, we let our guards down, as though the distance between me and any other, including my closest other, my sister, my family, my best friend, my partner, In fact, that distance in itself, according to Arendt, is productive, right? So she rather spatializes the idea of imagination. Yes, putting oneself in others' shoes, fair enough. But she has a metaphor of reaching across a round table, right? So we're citizens of the world sitting around a rather big round table as ourselves, right? As individuals who are distinctive, who have our unique characteristics. Playing at this difference, she looks at interest, breaks it down into interest, the in-between, and that space, right? And that is what allows us to be able to imagine. And in fact, the argument goes that everybody can do it because there is always that distance between self and other. No matter how close and how much affinity we share in our intellectual life, in our physical life, in our emotional life. That might be something productive to think about. Perhaps then linking the physical of the dance, of the theater, right, of the singing, the very vocalization of one's expression, right, at the core. Whether we can understand each other completely, argumentatively, verbally, there is the resonance that comes with the sonic, right, the oral, that we might consider as a part of some part of a human characteristic, right? So even as in the form of body language that is already there, that kind of communication might help us perhaps reach sympathy. And from there, I'd like to speak a little bit about phenomenology, right? The importance of experience in the way that we understand the world and experience it. Here I'm thinking specifically about Martha's first example from Tagore, the lived body, I guess that's Husserl, the body image, Merleau-Ponty, and then from then on, really how it is that we embody ourselves and lodge ourselves in the world such that we understand it better. And I keep on emphasizing the world because if we're talking about the global, right, I'm thinking about a context. Juxtaposed with that really is the feeling at home. How are we to feel at home in the global? How are we not always just interlocal as individuals from particular contexts that are really quite specific, right? Does it even make sense to talk about the global, right? I remember that in primary school, and I went to a pretty conservative English school for girls in Hong Kong. And every year at the graduation ceremony, each class, and this is a primary school from grades 1 to 6 then, each class needs to perform some intercultural performance. And I remember one year having to, be in the group that is singing a Japanese song and just spending a lot of time memorizing the different phonemes and trying to get that right. And of course, there is some sort of a very simple choreography that goes with it. That experience stayed with me. I did not understand it at all at the point of performing it, right? Until I actually traveled. So at around grade 6, I think, primary 6, and I was still in Hong Kong at that point. I think that was the year when there is a first Asia Pacific Children's Convention for Peace. Only 10-year-olds get invited. So you audition or you get interviewed when you're 9, right? And then you have all these participants from all over East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Asia, right? Every year from then on, it's just children coming together, delegations from cities, from countries, etc., pitching tent in this huge field in Fukuoka. Right in the countryside, etc. And I can't remember doing anything specifically cultural, but rather just talking to people. And the lingua franca is still English, even then. And just really experiencing, speaking to, in fact, others, right? In the same way that I would speak to my friends in my same classroom in Cantonese, in English. And that kind of physical proximity to any other person than me was an experience that somehow transformed my understanding of what it means to be less a global citizen, but just being a citizen. That I am sharing some space, perhaps quite a wide space, perhaps an artificial space, a constructed space, but nonetheless, that I feel somehow that I am more than just within my own environment, in my nuclear family, doing well in school, perfecting my performance of Japanese for a school performance. And that is when things started to click for me. From then on, while we're thinking about kind of distance and strangeness, I suppose strangeness opening up to a sense of awe of the world, that it is much bigger than what and who I am, but at the same time centered on the individual level, because that is how I participate in it. My subjective experience is what forms my perspective. That is perhaps something that we might bear in mind, right? On the one hand, there is pluralism, a lot of difference in the world. On the other hand, it doesn't mean that with this pluralism comes necessarily relativism, that we can't prioritize, right? Helping behavior, etc., right? Empathy and ethos that makes us perhaps global citizens rather than our exact locations vis-a-vis others. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed, Sissy. And we'll move straight on to Karolina.
Yes, I just want to know, I have a PowerPoint. Is it better to stand there
Then you can control it yourself. I always find that more comforting, but it's up to you. Our technicians will do it for you if you'd like to remain sitting.
Who's the technician? And I can wave, sort of.
He's in there.
He's in there, okay.
Yeah.
No, I think
it's
going to be less...
you would like to? Right.
I'll stand here, thank
Just use the arrows up and down,
All
those
right.
two.
Yeah, thank you very much. I also would like to... My name is Karolina Surrency. I also would like to thank the ISS for giving me this opportunity to talk, and thanks to Martha Nussbaum for her inspiring lecture. Thank you very much. At the University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht, we were actually one of the first Dutch universities to appreciate Martha's work, and it has been included in our curriculum ever since she received an honorary doctorate in 1999 from our university. One of the ways that we work with Martha Nussbaum's ideas and the human development and capability approach in more general is in an annual school on pluralism and development with participants and teaching staff from India, Indonesia, Uganda, South Africa, and the Netherlands. And the participants are both scholars, young scholars, activists, and work in NGOs. Maybe I could have the next, oh no, I was going to do this myself. No, this is 3 of them just from this year. So this year the school will take place for the 10th time, and it's going to be taught in Bangalore in India this time, and it's all been made possible by HIVOS. You can't hear. Is it working? I should stand much closer. Okay. All right. Then I should speak louder. Thank you. Central to in this school is the idea of human dignity in a world of diversity, difference, and inequalities. And our pedagogic approach in the school is one in which we try not only to have cognitive development in terms of studying, vigorously studying text, social theory particularly, but also affect, where students live and work together intensively for a month and not only learn about human dignity and pluralism, but also in fact try to live it. And this has been our way, or one of our ways, to build understanding, concern, empathy, and sympathy, as you heard in Martha Nussbaum's talk. And the experience of this school are the basis of what I'd like to say. And I'd like to raise 2 issues on the basis of our experiences in this school in the past 10 years. The first, wait, I was going to show you one other. It's about living pluralism. We're on our way here to Soweto, actually, in South Africa. And yeah, somebody's performing a dance. And so that works, connects well to the previous speakers. And the first issue that I'd like to address is different understandings in our global group about what it means to be an individual. And this concern problematizes the idea of who is we and who is the other and who is I when we in our class attempt to build understanding, concern, sympathy, and empathy. Roughly speaking, there's one group whose basic point of departure can best be summarized as I am, therefore we are. And the other group starts with a different basic assumption captured by I am because we are. Frequently, those two positions have been captured as a dichotomy between individualism and communitarianism. And here a significant question is whether the we is a result of many I's or that the we becomes prior to I. And these matters are closely related to concerns of identity, formation of identity, identity politics, and the ways in which identities are mobilized, denied, affirmed through established political imagination and institutions. Having been brought up in a Western context, or largely being a product of liberal education myself, I'm most familiar with the position of the first group. I am, therefore we are. Here the assumption is that without me, the collective cannot exist. And this obviously forms the basis of social contract theory, which assumes that in modern states, individual citizens come together on the basis of individual informed consents. And when there's no tension between the I and the we, my life will go fairly smoothly. However, if there is such tension, there's also an exit clause. I can get out of the collective. I can dispense with the collective. This situation presumes that I have, or that I should have, the freedom to disassociate, and under a liberal constitution, my decision to disassociate will be supported by a principle of equality upheld by rule of law. Now, for the ones that start with the other proposition, I am because we are in the group, there are different primary considerations. Here, the we becomes before the I, and their life experiences often show that being we helps one. Being foremost we helps one to lead a dignified human life in which my humanity can exist through the humanity of the other, and in which not individuality and individual informed consent are the basis of my affiliation, but interconnectivities and relationships. These kinds of experiences in the realm of the summer school made me wonder if the dichotomy between individualism and communitarianism is perhaps too simplistic in our age of globalization. Is there a dialogue possible between these two positions? I'll quickly get into the second issue, and the second issue concerns the link between education in a global age and emerging changes in the social action space. Our objective in the school is not just to foster the understanding and sympathy, etc., but also to try and equip students to address matters of injustice in their own research, in their work for NGOs or as activists. And in the last 10 years, we've witnessed the growth of new global vulnerabilities across the spectrum, particularly affecting the poor. It seems that many established frameworks, normative frameworks, are loosening with regard to people's ideas and experience of justice, equity, equality, human rights. Growing groups of people question the possibilities within and the credibility of the modern state to bring about social change. They express their doubts, their skepticism about the ability of political parties, politicians, and bankers to bring about the ideals and the values which have been foregrounded in their constitutions. Many express their frustration and anger about a growing gap between the values of the Constitution and their everyday lived reality. And I would like to give examples that indicate the changes in the social action space and change, in my view, the civic space in which change is advocated. The first one has to deal with the use of ICT and the new possibilities of people communicating, mobilizing, intervening, and this changes the way people express their solidarity, their empathy, their sympathy, their affiliation, and their willingness for advocating social change. The next one is that there are new understandings of identity as a politicized site. Here, previously assigned identities are questions. New identities are asserted. Good example of this is the emergence of the so-called Pasmanda movement in India. Pasmanda means those who are left behind, and it's a fast-growing group of poor Muslims who claim that their interest and their pursuit of a better life cannot be adequately represented by upper caste Muslims, and that their political identity, in fact, is much more closely related to poor Hindus. So they are creating a new identity for themselves and asserting that in the political space, and there they are upsetting the status quo, the status quo of the political institutions is much more comfortable with dealing with religious diversity rather than in class terms. So this is a march of a Pasmanda march in the northern Indian city of Patna. Lastly, what we've all seen across the globe is new forms of mass protest. People have been mobilized, but not by political parties, not by NGOs. They are not by particular ideological movements, such as what is happening in Brazil right now. Or if we go to Turkey, I have an example here. Let's consider Turkey, where the action of Erdem Gündüz, also known as the Standing Still Man, on a Monday evening, he arrived at Taksim Square. He stood there, arms in his pocket, and looked at the picture of Ataturk. And within no time, news spread of this man standing there, and many people started joining him. And now there's this silent form of protest is spreading across Turkey. Now, what kind of empathy and sympathy and all that, how do we understand that? So I believe that these kinds of things, again, show that there are new notions of what difference is, there are new notions of who the other is, and it poses new questions in how do we build understanding, concern, empathy, sympathy for those whom we consider to be different. And that sort of brings me to a question which I hope we have time to deal with. And this is my question, particularly to you, Martha, but perhaps also to some of the other people here. How do you think education in a global context could help to energize these emerging questions of social change and reframe new normative concerns that I see? Thank you.
Is this on again? Yes, it is. And our last speaker from the panel, Des Gasper. The floor is yours, Des.
Thank you. Just some thoughts and questions about how to move from the big inspiring agenda of concerns which Martha and similar thinkers put before us, how to convert that into practicable educational activities in situations limited in many ways, including limited by the qualities of the staff, as you will perhaps see in my presentation. Universities are terribly important. We're dealing with the leaders of the future. We have a privileged space where we can think relatively freely and yet combine creativity with critical examination, which requires this openness to other experiences, other arguments, and in the process we hope build openness of mind and heart. That sounds great, and but the constraints on doing that in university education are probably greater and anyway different from those in earlier stages of education. Martha wrote the book Cultivating Humanity in the 90s, which reviewed many experiments on these lines in the US. And I always felt that we need European equivalent, many equivalents, because there's a lot to learn, and there are also lots of constraints, some of which increase, as people touched on before. Some of the pressures on universities increase. One of the structural constraints we have is disciplinarity in universities, which I want to raise, and I want to raise it especially in relationship to the challenges of sustainability, environmental sustainability, which is a big arena now for the sorts of concerns that Martha asks us to include in education regarding wider sympathy, longer time horizon, etc. And yet we are largely existing in and products of this sort of, here's one of the metaphors for disciplinarity. The disciplines they're very tough, self-sufficient, spiky, a bit dry. They're very good at preserving their vital fluids, but they're not very good at interacting with each other. And so many issues. I will skip the text. Here's a recent, perhaps, example. I was looking at the Oxford Handbook on Climate Change and Society. And so I was giving a talk on the university in relationship to sustainability. I looked up the index, expecting to find lots of discussion of the university. There was 0 listings of university. Now, is it because universities are so perfect? I don't think so. Or is it because they're perfectly useless? Well, something in between, where universities have potential, but when either we take for granted their limitations, or we have got tired of thinking about how to battle for inter and transdisciplinarity in relationship to these big challenges within universities. Now, certainly there are many experiments going on, and I'll come to that also. Here are a couple more metaphors for disciplinarity. Seeing the world in one way, and then also the Cyclops, the angry giant, is very muscular, and it gets angry also because other people don't see the world in exactly the same way it does. All right, we're trying to build into education richness in many ways, including the affective richness, and yet the pedagogical challenge is major. And Shaw put some of it nicely. He said, you can't teach people much. If you teach them, they won't learn, and they have to encourage learning. And yet we are all trained in a pedagogy based on, in effect, the Cyclops type of disciplines in which we know a lot and we want to teach it. And the skills required for moving to encouraging learning are ones that are non-trivial and and also are contextual. So what will work in particular situations, times, places, groups of students is contextual. So we need to innovate. One of the themes that we need to learn skills for incorporating is this narrative dimension, the learning through stories, because stories are so enriching in many ways. And yet, how do we fit that into university time schedules and examination-oriented education and so on? Scenarios thinking is one good area where we can bring in some of the narrative richness and build the narrative imagination. That's embodied also in, for example, human security analysis. But really I've got questions. Here's my last slide. This is a recent book, in effect following up the agenda that Martha and others have laid down for us, trying to share experiences from around the world. And we need much more of this. We need it also in The Hague, we need it in the Netherlands, we need it globally. I'm happy to conclude with this book just out, because the lead editor, Sandra Boni, began working on the book while spending some time here at ISS. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Des. I promised that because some of the panelists directed almost... Oh yes, I need to move away from that one. Almost direct questions at Martha. She's going to just talk for 2 or 3 minutes, pulling together 1 or 2 threads that were of particular interest and resonance to her before I throw the floor open. The 2 ladies who are going to be working with mics, they might like to position themselves so as not to lose time. You might like to sort of get one there and one there so that we're ready to go for the fray shortly. Martha, a few minutes for you.
I will be... Oh, how does this go on? It seems not to be on. Where's the switch? Oh, okay. Well, I'll use this one. No, that's not on. That's not on either. There. Well, oh, okay. Well, I have to hold it right up here, I guess. Okay. Well, first of all, I want to thank you 3. Those presentations were great. So I'm going to be very, very brief and just talk about 2 things that were suggested to me by the remarks. First of all, I guess thinking about Sissy's terrific question, how do we feel at home in the global? I think there's one very important thing that one has to think about when one thinks about education in connection with that question, and that is that no global culture is any more homogeneous than one's own culture. I think most American students would never dream of thinking that American culture could be tidily summarized in a short course, and they would think of it in terms of conflict and in terms of movement and in terms of change and so on. But somehow or other, when they get to studying India or something, the instinct is to try to reduce it to a single thing. And so you do hear talk of Indian culture has this view of women and so on. And they miss the regional variation, the class variation, but also the dynamism and the pressure for change that all cultures contain. So I think it's very important that any good instruction in the global should fight free of that. And when I started doing work on women and human development, I had noticed that a lot of feminist writings about developing countries would pull in one example from Iran, one from China, and so on. And they were supposed to be sort of representative in quotes, but of course they just ended up flattening and effacing and obscuring. So I decided I'd just talk about one country, and I tried to get to know that country as well as I possibly could in order to be able to manifest the dynamism and the variation. And of course one never does that fully enough, but at least it gives you a sense of what needs to be done in education. So that's one thing to mention. The other is was suggested, I think, particularly by Karolina's wonderful example of the movement of poor Muslims in Bihar who made common cause with poor Hindus, that the issue of class, that is to say, the global is also the local. You might not have to go more than 2 blocks from your home to encounter a challenge to global understanding. And one might hope that children would go 2 blocks from their home, but of course schools being de facto as segregated by class as they are by race in my country, it's a real challenge to learn about class. And at lunch with the students, I was talking about my first international experience, but actually it was international in the class sense more than in the nation sense. I was on the experiment in international living and went to live with a working class family in Swansea in South Wales. And of course I thought I was in for some wonderful experience of British culture and so on. But what I really learned is what it's like to use outdoor plumbing, what it's like not to have a refrigerator, things that were fundamental to my understanding, and what it's like for children to be brought up to believe they have no hope of upward mobility, to tailor their desires to what they were taught they could expect, so the whole issue of adaptive preferences. So that was a truly international experience, and much more productive for me than if I had gone to live with some wealthy family in London or something like that. So I think that should always be on our agenda when we design such programs. And I'll just stop there.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, it's not very fair, I think, that you all know a bit about our panelists. You've been able to read about it and you've been able to listen to them, but they know virtually nothing about you. So I promised just before we started the conversation I'd do some rather simplistic showing of hands so they get a sense of the people to whom they are talking. So if you would forgive me, I will just begin with a rather pedestrian exercise. If you're a student, stick your hand up. Ah, they all cluster together. If you're a student in The Hague, stick your hand up. If you're a BA student, stick your hand up. If you're a master's student, put your hand up. If you're doing PhD research, put your hand up. If you're European, put your hand up. If you're not European, put your hand up. Some hands go up 2 or 3 times, but that always happens in a global context. If you're working for an NGO, put your hand up. If you work for a ministry, put your hand up. Is there anyone who hasn't had a chance to put his or her hand up at all in answer to any of these questions? What do you do?
I have been retired. I've been working for many years with retarded children as a director of a school.
Thank you very much and welcome. Right, so this is your audience. Few rules. The 2 ladies are helping with the mics. They've been told that, well, they won't exactly get sacked, but they're meant to keep hold of the microphones, be in charge of the microphones, so don't struggle with them. They have been asked to keep control so as many people as possible can have an opportunity to speak. So what I'll do is just open the floor to questions at random, and we'll see what the questions bring out, and we'll bounce back and forth between the panel. We might try and bounce back and forth amongst each other, but it's quite a lot to do with so many in the room, but we'll see how it goes. First of all, questions. When you get a chance to answer a question, someone will run across to you and give you a mic, or let you speak into a mic, not give it to you. Could you please say your name, your nationality, and where you're studying or working or have worked, just to get a sense of where the question is contextualized. So, first question. Gentleman over here.
A very good afternoon. My name is Khalid Ahmed Chaudhry from International Human Rights Commission. I'm a Dutch as well as a Pakistani citizen. I have a question. What sort of suggestions you could give to some countries like Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, and Yemen, where the madrasa schools, the religious schools, are rising like mushrooms since past few decades. So rising questions of some sort of extremism and fanaticism, coming out of those schools. So getting those future global citizens into the mainstream. Any possibility that international community, philanthropics would like to reach up to those countries, not only the states, but the educational institutions to work together? Thank you.
Thank you. Anyone would like to take this question? Martha?
I'll say something. I mean, I think the first thing to say is each of those countries is very different. And actually, the problem you mentioned does not seem to me to be a big problem in India. Other problems are there, such as the total failure of government schools in rural areas, the problem of private tuition, and so on. But the studies of the schools that Amartya Sen's Prodigy Trust have done and other good studies do not show that really the tendency of students to go to religious madrasas is a particular problem. Muslims are greatly disadvantaged in Indian society. They don't have access to basic education, but it's not so much, that's not the problem. So, I mean, let me talk about India, because I have studied that, and I haven't studied really. Bangladesh, I think, is a more mixed picture, and in Pakistan, what you say has certainly been a problem for a long time. In India, there are really two schools of thought, and one is Amartya Sen's effort, which is to really reform the government schools and make them do their job by getting the teachers' unions to denounce private tuition, by getting teachers to show up, and so on. And in other words, to get out of this situation where, for example, the number 2 law school in the country is in Hyderabad, 40% Muslims in the region, not one Muslim in the entering class in that law school. Why? I asked the dean. He says, oh, well, the entrance exam is in English. They don't learn in the primary schools. So, you know, how to get equality and justice for Muslims, as the Sachar Commission report shows, is a huge problem, and the failure of the government schools is the cause, but then maybe we can reform that. So that's what Amartya Sen and Jean Drèze hope. But Gurcharan Das, a very wealthy private citizen who's written about this topic extensively as a journalist, is now using his extensive fortune to start a network of low-cost, or in some cases free, private schools. And those are springing up like mushrooms all over the place. Not religious schools, so far as I can, I mean, the ones he's starting certainly aren't, but the others are not either, really. And so my university is just opening a Center for Collaborative Research in Delhi, and that's going to be the first opening event we're going to have. It's going to bring Jim Heckman, the great economist who studies early education, together with both Jean Drèze and Gurcharan Das to see what they can come up with on that topic. I think when there is a problem of religious schools springing up, it's partly the result of earlier failures. I mean, it obviously is. I think in Pakistan, had many nations given their financial and human assistance to Pakistan much earlier, rather than just thinking entirely in terms of nuclear strategy and this and, you know, the defense issues. If they had thought of what was pejoratively called nation building, that is really aid to education, the situation might not have developed in the way that it has. Now that it has, it's harder to reverse. But I do think, you know, there are plenty of private individuals, from the Aga Khan to many foundations, who are certainly trying to address it. And I think it's a very difficult situation, which I wish I knew more about. In Bangladesh, of course, you have a very progressive nation, which through many NGOs and through many government efforts has been a very strong force and still is, but then it's increasingly under pressure from religious schools. And there I think there's at least enough has been done in the other direction to have a hope of staving off extremism, because when children have other opportunities, when they know that they can learn about the world, and when girls' education is strongly defended and strongly encouraged, and incentives are given to families for educating girls, then I think that situation you described does not develop so much. But anyway, each country is quite different.
Thank you very much. Gentleman in the front there. Karim.
Hello, my name is Karim Benamar. I'm Dutch and Algerian, and I'm a philosopher. And my question is about these concept of empathy, compassion, and sympathy that you've used. We can understand compassion as suffering with, in a kind of sense of perhaps akin to pity, or the sense of suffering with being with somebody who suffers, but also perhaps in a Buddhist sense of people are fallible and we're not judging them. We have compassion with the fact that people are fallible, and so we don't judge very quickly. So to what extent, when we talk about these concepts, are they cultural, as they perhaps would be exemplified in great works of art or something like that? And to what extent are they experimental, when you refer to people who look at how very young children learn or something like that in terms of objective testing? And does it matter, the relationship between these two?
Well, I think those are great questions. Let me try to be really brief because I want to give the other people a chance to ask. But first of all, I don't quite want to say that compassion is suffering with, because notice that sometimes the people for whom you have compassion are not aware of their bad situation. If a person has, this is an example Adam Smith already gave, if a person has had brain damage and they've lost the use of their mental faculties, they might not suffer. It might be a case where they're playing like a happy child, but one might feel great compassion with that predicament. So it's a pain at the bad predicament of another person. And it's also not quite the same as being non-judgmental, I think, because you might want to be very judgmental and say, you know, this woman who's been raped, that's a terrible thing. And I think to stand back and say, well, we're not going to judge whether rape is bad, I think that would be just the wrong stance to take when you see a woman who's been raped. And of course, there are many similar cases. So I think compassion often requires taking a stand about things that are bad. You might make a mistake. You have to be prepared to change your mind, but yeah, you do have to take a stand. Now, what is cultural about it? I think it's clear that the capacity for first empathy and then as knowledge of the world and of suffering develops compassion are based on inherited biological equipment. So there's a universal foundation. But as Paul Bloom quite rightly says, that's minimal. It's just a basis. It's a resource, but everything else is culture, because culture is what's going to teach you principles of fairness. It's going to be what teaches you what things are bad, what you have a right to, what is a violation of rights. I mean, how do people know that when somebody's screaming and crying, the situation is really bad? Because they have to learn that from their culture. Now then, there's of course great room for error, and all cultures make great errors and often teach you to withhold compassion from people because they say, oh, a fallen woman, you know, she had sex with somebody, no compassion for her. And interestingly, in Fontana's great novel, Effie Briest, at the end, the parents who have had no compassion for their daughter because she had an affair and was a fallen woman, the dog has compassion, and he's weeping by her grave. And that shows you something. There's an inherited tendency to love and concern that was blocked by the bad culture. So, you know, that's where it goes wrong. And it often can also teach you to have compassion, as I said, with the rich people who whine and complain that they have to actually pay taxes. So it is prone to all kinds of errors, and that's why I think it always needs to be in a dialogue with principles.
Thanks so much. Question at the very back, someone with a green t-shirt on. Perhaps you could come towards the mic, speed up that would be really helpful. Thank you very much.
Hi. Oh yeah, I'm not supposed to take it hand in hand. My name is Kate Kirk. I'm a lecturer and a researcher at the VU University Amsterdam. I was wondering if you could reflect briefly on this we have a lot of new liberal arts colleges, small colleges. Many of them are selective, similar to American universities, so not every child who goes to college or high school, a certain kind of high school, can get in. But they stress academic rigor, and excellence is the kind of the buzzword. But on that side, how do we balance that academic rigor on one side and actual learning? Because what I see happening is very often a focus on grades, a focus on the technical detail and not the learning. And so how we in these liberal arts institutions can strike a balance between these two
Thank you.
Sure, I'll give it a shot.
Excellence and learning. Sissy.
Great, thank you, Kate. I'm not entirely sure that there is a tension or any opposition between the concept of excellence and, on the one hand, I suppose, academic high achievement, right? I guess your question and the idea of learning, but rather perhaps your question is more about how we measure excellence and what counts towards academic achievement. And you know what, on an institutional level, as Des has mentioned, there are all sorts of indicators because these are statistics that could be used because these are things that can be measured. As with welfare, the hardest thing to measure is happiness, growth, development, right? On whose terms, by whose definition. I can't speak for other university colleges, but let me try to articulate what we try to do at in The Hague, at any rate, so Leiden University College. On the one hand, yes, there is always some rigmarole about what should count towards the final GPA, what is a failing grade, honors, designations, etc., etc. We've just experienced our first graduation, and yes, it is a bit of an adventure. But beyond that, what we discover in the classroom, it's still quite big. The size is no more than 20 students. In a regular seminar, say a tutorial seminar that one would have in a liberal arts college in the US, we're talking about 3 to 5. If we're looking at Oxbridge, we're talking about 1 to 2. Right? But in the Dutch system, kind of capping at 20 is quite already a kind of, a luxury, right? And beyond that, I think at the end it is about the kind of conversations that one is able to have with one's students, and also the conversations and the dialogues amongst the students, not only in the classroom, but in the intensive preparation before coming to class and then after class. And there is this idea through academic extracurricular activities, that in fact this dialogue continues and the learning is beyond the classroom and the texts and what a professor is professing. The learning style is very much based on discussion and seminar, and it is about articulating one's thoughts, as much experimenting with what is going through one's head as with articulating a particular stance, a particular argument. So just to wrap up here, I'm not entirely sure that there is necessarily any tension between excellence and learning or wanting to achieve that.
I want to comment on this too, because I've teach, although University of Chicago is a large university, our undergraduate body is only 3,000, and so we do have we're the size of a large liberal arts college, and that's how we teach. And 20, in fact, is about the size of an introductory course in our core curriculum. And I visited a lot of liberal arts colleges, and I guess I would say that in that system, there's less tension between learning and assessing than in any other system, because you assess on the basis of an in-depth interaction with the student, which includes both discussion in the class and then extensive commenting on the student's writing assignments. And of course, it's hard to do that if you're in a much larger or more impersonal institution. And when I taught at Harvard, I did teach 500 people in a class, but then they had small discussion sections, and those people did all the commenting and the grading. So whenever you're able to do that, then you give the students feedback that's essential for further growth and learning, while you're also giving them a grade. And Brown University, where I taught for many years, did experiment with having no grades. It doesn't work very well, because young people are not perfect and they're not responsible. And so just as a motivator for making sure they do the reading and do their work, I'm afraid you do need the grade. But it should, if it's only the grade, then you learn nothing. But it's really the quality of the interaction.
I just want to say just one line. I think the speaker was right, that there is, in the Dutch context, a great danger of just, within the context of higher education in Holland, to stress academic excellence as a very narrowly defined, grade-oriented. My youngest daughter is a second-year student at a liberal arts college in Utrecht, and she's about to finish her second year, and I asked her, what has now been your greatest achievement this year, which was being appointed to the Bar Commission. She assured me, so that sort of put my mind at ease, that, now she feels she's really joined the social crowd as well as the intellectual crowd, and that was good. So there is space for that, but it needs to be struggled for, I think, yeah.
Thank you. Maybe it's good to hear from some students here. We had huge numbers of students, and we're talking a lot about education. Are your inner eyes being developed by the education you're receiving, enjoying, enduring at the moment? Is there anyone who'd like to engage in a little bit of conversation with our panelists around this? There's a gentleman in the back who has a comment.
Thank you. I'm Jocelyn Nienhuis from Leiden University College. And we've been discussing here how we can use imagination to increase our understanding of other people's cultures. And I would like to ask a more experimental question. Say we achieve this goal of having full awareness of each other, and then we proceed with this process there already is of globalization, of cultures merging more together. Then I wonder, wouldn't that be rather boring if everyone suddenly knows everyone else becomes more like everyone else? Like going on holiday and you see the same kind of houses, the same kind of people, the same kind of characters, personalities, and so on, the same language. So I would like to hear some reflections on that. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can
Martha.
I think you know, it would be a mistake, first of all, to think you ever know anyone completely. I mean, that would be a terrible error in families, in relation to oneself, but also in the world. Because, as Proust said, a real person imposes a dead weight that your consciousness cannot get through. He actually thought that a fictional character was the only one that you could get to know thoroughly, because they were transparent in a way that real people weren't. And so on. He also thought you didn't want to dominate the fictional character, and with real people you always want to dominate them, and that impedes understanding. But anyway, we always have these problems. One time I was out in rural Rajasthan with an activist who works with girls' literacy, and I said, you know, how would you answer the persistent question whether a person from another country can understand the way of life of someone in rural Rajasthan? And she thought for a while, and she said, you know, I have the greatest difficulty understanding my sister. Now, I think what she was saying is, you know, there always is some obstacle, and you just have to think, what is the obstacle? In the case of the sister, it might be jealousy, and that might be a very powerful obstacle to understanding. And in the case of another culture, it's different. It might be, in some cases, less. I do find some contexts where, as an outsider, it's easier for me to have access to people because issues of caste and purity don't get in the way, like with sex workers, where, let's say, a Brahmin whom I might go into the room with would be regarded with suspicion by the sex workers, but I'm regarded as, oh, well, you know, you dye your hair, so you must be like one of us, or something like that. and no, really, I mean, that is an interesting way that I've been related to by sex workers in India. And so, so in any case, I think you just have to ask, what are the obstacles, and how shall I get round them? But then, of course, when you understand me, I mean, one of the great things that makes life fun is difference. And so I don't see any reason to think that understanding produces homogeneity. It produces awareness of options. But why would everyone want to take the same option? I mean, you don't do that with your friends, don't you? I mean, don't you enjoy meeting people who are rather different from you? And do you find that you tend to become exactly like all your friends?
Do you want to give a quick answer?
Yeah.
Well, I agree with that point, but that's exactly why, if I fully understand and know my friends, which luckily isn't impossible, then that will be rather boring, because I already know them the moment I understand them completely.
Well, I bet you don't, but anyway.
Okay, thank you. There's a question over here. Lady with a microphone.
Shall I walk to the microphone? That might be easier. My name is Elske van Hoek, and today is my last day as director of the Expatriate Archive Center, and I'm also managing director of the English Theatre. So I combine internationalism with the arts and with history. As working in an international community constantly, I'm very aware of the questions that are there and that are being raised constantly. It is actually, I'd like to applaud what you're doing here today, because what I also experience working in an international environment in the Netherlands is sometimes that people just sort of look at you and think, but we live in Holland, why would you do something in English? That would be, so there is, of course, there is very much a movement all around the world to retreat at the moment. So I think it's incredibly important that Martha's voice is being heard. There's one thing that, of course, in the expatriate world, which is considered to be sort of a higher social class echelon, is the concept of the third culture kids. And I wonder whether you have ever studied the third culture kids. It's a concept that has started to come about in the 90s. It was expanded on by Ruth van Reken and David Pollock. And actually these are sort of these international communities where children grow up and actually sort of form a new culture. They are sort of breeding grounds for your ideas. Have you ever studied them, and have you ever come across indeed that the understanding has been growing, and it is sometimes argued that a lot of leaders that are third culture kids are better leaders. I doubt it, by the way, because many, many leaders in this world are actually third culture kids and questionable.
Thank you.
Well, no, I haven't studied it, and I kind of doubt whether it would produce a specific kind of person, because you're always coming into that third culture situation from someplace. The people I know who grew up like that in, let's say, the American school in Libya, you know, they're privileged children of rich people, you know, so that positionality never goes away, and you never, so if you aren't distinguished by, let's say, religion or some other mark of difference, you are distinct from others by class, and you're not meeting, there's no third culture that includes, unfortunately, the very poor and marginalized. So I don't know what it really means to say it's a third culture, and if one thinks of it as a genuine universality, even when it doesn't include people who are poor or are marginalized in that society, then it probably would be an exercise in self-deception. I think often these, certainly what I know is the American schools in this place or that, and they're often very, very insular, because the whole point is to keep Americans from encountering anyone else. So, but you know, then the other thing that I want to say is that I think there's so many ways of exploring or creating a new culture. I myself have moved from one part of American culture, the kind of elite WASP Protestant part, to a kind of urban left-wing Jewish part, and you know, my daughter moved back again, marrying someone from East Germany, you know, so there are all sorts of ways that people have of creating new cultures within their own lives, and so I wouldn't think we would want to limit the study just to this specific group that you mentioned. Does anyone else want to talk about that?
Yeah, I think we will leave that point there, and we'll take one more question, two more, and then we'll give the panelists an opportunity just for 1 or 2 minutes to bring out anything that they feel they'd like to leave us with before we go upstairs and have a cup of tea and, of course, continue the conversation. So, lady over there.
Thank you. My name is Hans Alma. I'm a cultural psychologist at the University of Humanistic Studies. I have a question, I think, both for Martha Nussbaum and for Karolina Surrency. Karolina, you told us how these two groups of students in the summer schools have different views of themselves, different ways of identifying themselves, and, well, we might say they have different social imaginaries. And you asked yourself and us perhaps whether we could come between this dichotomy and think of it in another way. And it reminded me of what Arjun Appadurai calls the contestation, the space of contestation. The imagination is a space of contestation. Might this entering this space of contestation in a critical way be a way of breaking through this dichotomy? And that brings me to the question for Martha Nussbaum. Is cultivation of the imagination a way of entering this space of contestation, or how do you see that?
Thank you. Does it work? Yeah. I think what I meant to say was that when you actually engage in global education, whereas the global is in the classroom, in that sense, we think we know when we talk about fostering empathy and sympathy, indeed, and then once you come across real people and real situations, you find that people would start from different points of departure about who's the other and who am I. And in that sense, I did find that this dichotomy between either people are individualist or they are in a communitarian, I found it less and less helpful within the group in terms of when we make our efforts through workshops, through all kinds of means to try and make people understand what it's like to be in the shoes of someone else. The notion of who I am and who someone else is very deep, and I think, you know, I at least have learned to question my own presumptions as a teacher in how to approach the class. I think, yes, contestation, I think it's a good concept to use. but perhaps also dialogue, in the sense of, obviously dialogue can be part of contestation, but contest obviously also has a kind of, contesting type of dichotomy thinking in it. So I think one can, if one understands it also having contestation with oneself, I think that then it's a rich concept, and I would gladly use it.
Thank you very much. And one last question I'd like to reserve for a student. Is there a student who has a question? There's a student at the back of the room, and the microphone, this one, I'm sorry, I picked at random the lady over there.
Hello, my name is Laura Limbert. I study at the Hague University of Applied Sciences, and I study law. The International Court of Justice is currently hearing a case on whaling, and Professor Gasper has briefly referred to sustainable development. And my question to the panel is, how can education further empathy and sympathy and concerns for the environment with respect to the younger generations?
Thank you. Des, I think your honour calls upon you to answer this one.
Well, very briefly, I wish I knew. Short answer.
Anyone else who wants to respond there? It's a... Yeah? Very.
I think you're raising a very important question, and one of the things that we actually do in our summer school is that we take the Human Development Index and then put it, juxtapose it over the footprint analysis. And then it becomes clear that the higher the Human Development Index, in other words, the higher we think about human well-being, the worse it is for the Earth. So there's something wrong with our thinking about human well-being, because how can we think of well-being in the context where the Earth is not being able to sustain our well-being? So I think young people need to see that picture, and indeed to think beyond yourself, and also to realize that what is happening with the Earth is mostly concerning poor people. I know in Holland, you can have rain on end, which is pretty bad, but if you live in Bangladesh, the consequences are much worse.
Thank you. Sissy wants to respond briefly here, and we'll also make Sissy's comment in response to your question, the begin of the last round. So Sissy will be, first of all, responding to the question, and then moving on to her just a minute of important things she would like to leave all of us with after this conversation. And then we'll move to Martha, to Karolina, and to Des with about a minute each, just the very most important thing they want to say to us before we all go upstairs. Sissy.
Very important question, I think. Thank you very much, Laura. At the end, I think, given that you're talking about a case at the ICC, given that you're studying law, I think one way that academia could contribute towards perhaps an awareness of intergenerational justice, right, is through precisely interdisciplinarity. And if not, even transdisciplinarity, looking at the practical aspects of what it is that we generate in the classroom, bringing it beyond the study of political science, of economics, of sociology, of law, right, of philosophy, history, etc., and bringing it all together. And I suppose I'll conclude by trying to get back to the question about third culture kids. A little while ago. At LUC, we do have a lot of self-identified third culture kids. And let me say that any kid at around 17 to 19 years old is tremendously confused about how they wish to identify. So even if one is from a, to use a, from a monoculture, that in itself also is a struggle. And I think the role of good educators, of course, we should continue to educate ourselves as well, is to take that very human component of trying to find our place in the world seriously, in a university setting, but also from even in the case of a Montessori nursery school, and start there and have young people feel supported to experiment with thoughts and go from there.
Thank you.
Okay, I'll just use my minute to respond to my part of the question that came about the space of contestation. I
what I want to say about this, there's so many things to say about it, but one thing is I think it's very difficult, but extremely important to create a pedagogical space in which people of widely varying views speak to one another with respect. And this means, fostering in one's own person and in the nature of one's arguments, the idea that all positions deserve to be heard, all positions deserve to be taken seriously, and we just don't demonize people because they have the wrong politics or something else. Now, my university, especially our law school, happens to have an unusually broad political spectrum. Most American leading law schools are entirely liberal left, and there are very few people who are conservative, and then they sort of hide away if they're at Harvard or Yale. But in our law school, we try to include the whole political spectrum. That means I'm deliberately trying to open up a space for people with whom I deeply disagree, and they do for me. And so in the student culture and also in the faculty culture. So when we discuss things like same-sex marriage, I always want to make sure that my colleagues who oppose it feel empowered to speak and to make their criticisms. And that's one of the hardest things. I think to listen to somebody from a different part of the world is, in comparison, easy. But when they're attacking things that you hold dear, for which you fought through a great part of your career, well, that's not so easy. And I mean, just to give you one fine concluding example of this, I gave a paper about same-sex marriage to our faculty colloquium. And during that colloquium, my most conservative colleague, who's a professor of corporate law, who was actually a former student of mine who took my class on feminist philosophy, so he's somebody of great curiosity as well as being very conservative. In fact, his wife had told him, you better learn something about the other side. She was much more liberal. But anyway, he asked some tough questions, which I was glad to have, because it's really a bad discussion if everyone is agreeing with you. And then afterwards, he wrote me an email saying, I hope you felt that the tone with which I posed my questions was respectful and appropriate, and I had. But I also thought it was great that he asked that question, and that's how we form a community in which anyone can raise an uncomfortable topic. It requires great fine-tuning all the time. But in any case, and it also requires disciplinary fine-tuning, because sometimes economists can be contemptuous of philosophers. That's not unknown, and vice versa, So we have to not only think of political differences, but the contestation across disciplines.
Thank you. Karolina.
Yes, I think that when we talk about fostering education in a global age, that it's important that we realize that we usually don't change just because of what we know, but we often are prepared to change if we also feel that we need to change. So I think, in my view, the role of affect is an important one that you should not separate from cognitive learning. And I think, one of our exercises in this group of multiple countries is often let's talk about what stereotypes exist in your country about the others. So it's not your stereotypes, because we all know that the people we're with, they're never prejudiced, but so then the funniest things come out, and there's a lot of humor needed to deal with that session. But our Dutch students are shocked, that they are smelly, that they are promiscuous, that they are colonialists. They never thought of themselves like that. Or, or like one of the woman from India, who was absolutely shocked when the participants from Africa said Indians are they're bad people. They exploit. They pay us badly. And she said, "What are you talking about? We are the actually the ones who have been oppressed by the British. We're the good ones." And so I think in that sense, feeling and knowing come together and talking about real people and not only in broad terms.
Thank you. Des, the last word is yours.
Okay, on Sustainable Development Education 4, I gave the short answer because I don't have a recipe, but there's lots of interesting research and there's lots of scope for research. Some of it would be about the intellectual framing that people bring to situations. So what Karolina described. Also, I've seen other research that is really eye-opening, that you take a simple set of criteria for, is there any sustainably developed country, the official international criteria, and no, there are no sustainably developed countries. Secondly, at the affective level, the stress which other panelists have put on this is very challenging, about how fundamental it is. We don't ignore it in our education here, but I can't say it's central, it's marginal, yeah? We're very proud that we give it marginal space, but maybe we need to think about how you bring it in centrally. In general, there's lots of room for research on the topics we've been talking about third culture kids, about all these things, and for that we need networks and sharing.
Thank you very much. I would like to conclude before the cup of tea by offering just a small token of our thankfulness to the three speakers who've come today. It's a book by a local artist who actually died just a couple of weeks ago, but he makes very beautiful pictures of The Hague, and I would like to give one to you, Sissy. Thank you very much. One to you, Martha. Thank you very much indeed. And one to you, Karolina. Thank you very much indeed. I was too quick.
So you don't get a book?
He's one of ours. It wouldn't be fair for me to give him a present. We discussed it. I'd like to encourage you to continue the conversation upstairs. It's been a lovely session, far too short as always. We're very grateful to the speakers for coming here. Martha may join us for a brief cup of tea. Don't think she doesn't like us. She does have someone driving her away to her next appointment in Nijmegen. She's cramming a lot into a short period, but I know almost for certain she'll be back in the country next year, because I follow a nice little website which tells me about what the Dutch think about thinkers in the world and who they think are the greatest thinkers at the moment. And at the moment, Martha's top of the bill. If you look on the website, it's the Human sidekick of VPRO. If I say it in rather simplistic terms, we'll see who the Dutch think are the most important thinkers in the world, and Martha is right up there at the top. So I'm pretty sure she'll be back next year, because it's going to be a G8 of big thinkers in the eyes of the Dutch. Tea is upstairs, just the ladies there. I think perhaps you could lead the way. Help yourselves, continue the conversation about uncomfortable topics.
Okay, but I have to be in a car at 3:30 and I have to go get my coat first, so I don't think I can do it very well. Linda, could you please mail this to me, because I can't put it in my luggage. Hi.